Okay, so tonight we're in the book of Daniel, chapter 1. If you weren't here last week, I want to encourage you to go to our YouTube page. You can go on YouTube, or you can go to lakewoodcoc.com and then scroll down and click the sermon, or it says sermons or video or YouTube or something like that. You'll see the YouTube logo. Click on that and it'll take you there. I would highly encourage you to watch last week's class because it's got a lot of background information, some of which we'll review as we go through tonight, some of which is going to come in handy as we move into further chapters and get deeper into the book of Daniel. But last week we began Daniel with a history lesson by exploring the history of the book, and we talked about the history is important because it informs our understanding of what's being taught. It informs of our understanding of what is happening in the life and times of Daniel himself. And it's important because, especially with some of the visions and stuff, a understanding of history helps us better understand what's being said in those stories, if you will, in those visions and so forth, in those dreams. But we explored the history of the book, the Babylonians. Also, we talked about and the intentions that the author brings through the book. And this week, we move into digging more deeply into chapter 1. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 are famous. They're very, very well known in Daniel. A lot of Daniel is famous. We talked about last week that Daniel is quoted in the majority of the New Testament. And over again, we see Daniel quotes pop up or alluding to the book of Daniel and the teachings of Daniel. Chapter 1 is the beginning of the first half of Daniel, and it's characterized by stories of faith. Daniel, over and over again, points to the fact that God is in control. And over again, we see examples of Daniel and his friends, specifically in chapter 1, and then Daniel throughout the rest of the book. We see example over and over again of the belief and the faith and the actions from that belief and faith that take place that show they understood God was in control. And so this book is relevant. It's especially relevant to us today, I believe. With the coronavirus going rampant, it feels, with so much uncertainty, I think it's a good time to remember who controls everything, and that's God. And that God, even if God did not ordain or create or orchestrate something, God can still control things. Even when God allows things to happen, when he allows evil, because let's face it, if evil happens, it's not because God cannot control evil, it's because God allows for it to happen, right? Whenever evil happens and takes place, we see this in Daniel. God is still in control of the situation. The problem for humans is we often struggle to understand that God is in control. We often struggle to remember that God works in ways we don't necessarily work. And that's important for us to remember, because when it seems like God's not there, he's in the background working the whole time. And so chapter 1 begins to flesh out Daniel and gives characteristics of who he is. It begins the portion of the book that is stories and great stories of faith. Some of Daniel we talked about. This is important because as we go through the history over the next several chapters and we talk about stuff, remember, some of Daniel is not necessarily in chronological order, but we talked about last week that's because the ancients viewed history a different way than we do. And this is found throughout several of the Old Testament books where the order is different. In, let's say, First Chronicles and First Kings, you may see things out of order. It's because the chronological order was less important than the point that they were trying to get across with it. And so don't let that throw you when we come across some of that stuff. But the first few chapters are filled with heroic acts and realizations that humble us as well as humble those in the story. We find themes of bravery, humility. We find themes of great faith and wisdom and knowledge. We begin to notice, one person said, we begin to notice the careful dance between bravery and humility that takes place. And we see this starting right in chapter 1. Look with me in Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 1 and 2. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, last week we talked about this. We talked about how Nebuchadnezzar had ran the Egyptians down past Judah, that he had drove off the Egyptian army. And what he did is he conquered several places during this time. The defeat of Jehoiakim and capture of Jerusalem was predicted actually on many different occasions throughout history, in the Israelite history, that is. Deuteronomy mentions it several times. Jeremiah in chapter 32 talks about this taking place. But look in verse 2 here. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Do you guys remember what the land of Shinar represents? Anyone remember what Shinar, or even if you want to cheat and if you have a footnote that says it, that might be helpful too. But what does Shinar represent? It's another name for something. I'll give you a hint. Nebuchadnezzar is from there. Babylon. So Shinar is another name for Babylon. And so a century before Nebuchadnezzar marched on Judah and Jerusalem, God had already pronounced judgment on them through Isaiah. Whenever Isaiah spoke to King Hezekiah, that's found in Isaiah chapter 39, verses 5 through 7. And so we see this, that God, as the Old Testament often we see, God is true to what he says he's going to do. We need to understand something about God. God is always true and faithful. God will always follow through with what God has told us he will do. Whenever you look in Isaiah 39 in verse 5, it says, Then Isaiah said to King Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons, who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. This was Judah's punishment for their sins. And this becomes even more clear in the prayer by Daniel when we get into chapter 9 later on. One important note is in the coming years is that according to the Babylonian system of computing years and reigns, you're going to see a couple of different dates whenever you read through, especially if you read through commentary. But the gist is, it doesn't really matter. It's off by 1 or 2 years, and it depends upon how people, different kingdoms dated things different ways. We see this in Judah, in the Jewish kings. We see this in the Babylonian kings. We see it in the Assyrian kings. So when you see a couple of years off on a king, and it's not just here, any king, it's not an inconsistency. It's whoever's writing it, how they view the kingship. In other words, sometimes the first year of the king was counted as year 0. For example, in the Assyrians, they counted it as year 0. Whereas other ancient kingdoms, such as the Egyptians, they counted that as year 1, like we would normally do today. So we get into the first 2 verses here, and verse 2 talks about the Lord giving or delivering, depending on your translation, them into his hands. Again, we see over and over and over again who is in control. It's God. It's God that is in control. In verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. And we see what happens. He carries off these vessels and so forth. But God is in control at every step of the way. God is always in control. Hezekiah showed the Babylonians at an earlier date these treasures. It was around 100 years prior to this that Hezekiah shows the treasures. And then Isaiah predicted they would be taken from Babylon, as we read in Isaiah 39. Nebuchadnezzar only took some of these vessels at the time. We see later that others would be brought. But 60 years after Nebuchadnezzar, and this is important to Daniel as well as other prophets, 60 years later, do you guys remember Belshazzar and what Belshazzar did? He took those vessels and desecrated them. He took the vessels that were taken out of the temple of God and he used them in a feast. And it was a feast to a god, another god. And so all of this history comes into play with what happens from this moment forward for the people of God, even up until the kingdom of God came with Christ. And we get into that, especially in the next few chapters. The land of Shinar, which is another name for Babylon. Shinar was the site of the Tower of Babel. You guys remember that? Shinar is the site of the Tower of Babel. Let me make sure I've got I can't read some of my handwritten scribbles on my typed up notes because I keep adding notes. I type them up and I print it and then I'm like, oh, I want to share this. And so I scribble on it. And so let's see if I can read it. I believe it's in Genesis chapter 11. And if it's not, then we'll have to just, there it is. Chapter 11, I'm not going to read this, but here we see the building of the Tower of Babel. And as we see the building of this, we see God doesn't like this, does he? God rejects them, and God actually, they build Babel, and what does God do? God scatters them for this tower. And so the Shinar relating to the Tower of Babel and another name for Babylon, it's the idea of a rejection of God. It's the idea of going against God, rejecting the God. Now, Babylon was a polytheistic kingdom, right? They believed in multitudes of gods. In fact, they had no issue with the Jewish belief in Yahweh. The problem they have, and the problem any polytheist has, is whenever you exclude other gods. Whenever you claim that there is one God and only one God and exclude the others, that's when they begin to have issues. And we see this is something that the Greeks had, the Romans had, Egyptians had a multitude of gods. And so we see this taking place. When it comes to the gods, Nebuchadnezzar's god was most likely Marduk, we see, which is Bel, chief god of Babylon, who was worshipped by all. Nebu was the god of his father. This is, and we see names have meaning as well. He names his son Amel Marduk, which means man of Marduk. And this comes into play because when we get to the renaming of Daniel and his friends, the renaming are actually names that go against the Hebrew names. And so we see once again they're trying to rename and kind of rework the way they think, if you will. And so, but we see in the next several verses here, especially in verses 1 through 4, we see faith of Daniel. And throughout this chapter, I want to focus on 4 things. Daniel's faith. What are the characteristics of that faith? We're going to focus on that, and then we're going to see what he received and what his friends received based upon these characteristics of faith, because they're what we need to do as well. So we have some technical stuff tonight. We have what I find fun, others may not, but meaning the history part. But we also have the lessons. And the first thing we see in the first 4 verses is Daniel's faith was one of obedience. Daniel had an obedient faith. Look what it says in verses 3 and 4. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, with skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. I know I said 4, but I kept going. What we see here in 1 through, what was that, 6, what we see here is Daniel coming, and he's obedient because he's listed. He didn't run away. He didn't do anything he shouldn't have done. And in fact, we see some obedience in how he approaches the king here in a few moments. But Daniel's obedient in all that he does. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, at this point, it's rapidly expanding, and he needed men of great ability. He needed men who had knowledge, who were quick to learn and pick up on things, to help fill some of the positions of power and responsibility. Now, this is not uncommon. Alexander the Great did this as he was conquering the world. The Roman Empire began doing this and had great success with it. Rather than taking and just annihilating whoever it is that they conquered, they would enlist them, the youngest and the best and brightest and strongest, they would enlist them in the service. Because what it did is it bolstered the kingdom rather than kept the kingdom small while they're still trying to fight all these fronts and overcome these other places. So they were taken to Babylon to learn the way of the Babylonian king, if you will, how he wanted them taught and the business he wanted them to know. It may not have been necessarily brainwashing, but that was certainly part of it. And we see that through the renaming of the men. He wanted them to give their talents to the kingdom. Plato actually talks about this. According to Plato, the education of Persian youths, now I know we're talking Babylonians, but Persian Babylonians have very, very close similarities. The education of Persian youths began in their 14th year, and if the Babylonian practiced something similar, it would place Daniel and his friends probably around 15 years of age when they were taken in captivity, which would be a good age because we see the things that they're doing at that age are responsibilities and stuff for that age range. So many scholars, I say all that to say this is where many scholars get to the point they believe Daniel was probably in his latter teens. Some people say early 20s, but most likely it was latter teens because they did share very close similarities with the Persian Empire. So these men, what do you remember we had to have with the men that were chosen? Gives me a chance to get a drink. You can cheat and look in the Bible. What were the traits? Without blemish was one, right? Good looking. It was believed, by the way, that those who were good looking were more blessed by the gods, if you will, than those who were not, in their skill sets and so forth. People who were knowledgeable, able to make decisions, they had skill sets, right? Have you ever thought about why they wanted younger guys? It's because they can train them in how they want them, right? They can train them. So there's actually 2 languages that the Babylonians used. And one of those languages, the Coptic language, was the ancient Babylonian stuff. And it looked like, chicken scratch in Hebrew looks bad enough. This stuff, and I can't read any of this stuff. It makes hieroglyphics from Egypt look amazing. And so, but it's believed that they trained them in both languages that they would use so that they could know the history, know all of that stuff about Babylon, and produce whatever it was that the king set them to do. And we know Daniel, for example, became one of the wise men. In other words, one of the people who would interpret visions, but the king would seek as his counsel and so forth. And so we see all of this taking place. And then we see another interesting thing happen. The chief of the eunuchs in verse 7, the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. And here's where we get interesting. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. And so what's interesting here, what's interesting here throughout the book, from this point forward, Daniel is called Daniel in the book. His other 3 friends are known by their Babylonian names rather than their Hebrew names. That's why we remember his other friends through their Babylonian names, and we remember Daniel from his Hebrew name. Because I don't know why it does that, but it's interesting. Some authors believe that it's done intentionally by the author because Daniel's name and its meaning is judge. My judge is God. The God, El, is a reference to the God in heaven. So some believe it was intentionally done that way by the writer so that it's that Hebrew reminder constantly of Daniel sees God as his only judge, and Daniel lives accordingly, knowing that God will provide and God is in control as his judge. So Daniel means my judge is God, or El, which is the Hebrew. His Babylonian name, Belshazzar, is may a God protect my life. Isn't that interesting? Daniel, in the Hebrew, Daniel points to one true God, and in Babylonian name, it generalizes it to a God. And this is the case for everything. It flips all of these. Hananiah means the God, or Yahweh has shown grace, whereas Shadrach is not anything about grace, but it's about a different God. It's the command of Aku, which is the ACH at the back end of that, by the way. Mishael says, who is what El, or the God, is. Meshach, by the way, did you notice the subtle change in this? Nebuchadnezzar got, or not Nebuchadnezzar, the chief of the eunuchs got kind of interesting in this one. He subtly changes it to Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. And then Azariah is Yahweh has helped, where Abednego is servant of Nego. And so I know they don't match up in English because we have to transliterate and all that stuff in English, but in the Hebrews and the Akkadian language and so forth, it all kind of makes more sense when you look at it. But it's interesting that throughout the rest of this book, Daniel is Daniel, and his three friends are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It doesn't mean his three friends were unfaithful to God. I think the author who I quoted earlier had a point, that Daniel is believing in God, that God is the judge, and therefore he lives accordingly because he knows God is in charge, and it just ties it back together. Just if you're interested in ancient gods, Belshazzar was associated with Bel. Shadrach was associated with the moon god. Meshach, and I don't have this memorized, I'm reading my notes that I wrote down here, was the god of Aku, and then Abednego was associated with the god Nebo. So all of that's fun. If you want to go look those up, it's really interesting reads to learn more about those gods. But honestly, I want to get back to the applications. I want to get back to the next scriptures because we get into some really fun stuff here. So there's all your heavy ancient god historical stuff for the night. Still feeling good? Good-ish. Terry took his glasses off. He's got a headache. Okay. So we see obedience to God. In verse 8 and following, we see not only obedience, but now we see something that's more courageous take place here. We see courage. In verse 8 it says, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. What do you think would happen if you were given food by a king and it was the choicest of food and you refused it back then? Yeah, I saw that. Absolutely, Laura. You're done. It takes courage. Now, keep in mind, the way he approached it is not the way many people would probably approach it. And so, are we unmuting at the Johnsons? Okay, I got to know. So what's going on is he didn't want to defile himself, which we'll get to that in a few moments. But it says, therefore, and I have this underlined and circled in my Bible, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. I have two words, the whole sentence is underlined, and then I have two words circled, the word asked in the word to allow. Have you caught that? He doesn't go demanding his way. He doesn't go and say, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not make me eat this. What does he say instead? He says, he pulls him aside and he says, hey, this food isn't really kosher. This food doesn't really fit with our dietary religious laws. Is there anything we can do about that? It's a lot of times it's not what you ask, it's how you ask it, isn't it? And they have a real interesting conversation, by the way. They have a really great conversation about what's going on here. And but Daniel asks for permission. He says, look, I don't want to defile myself. And by the way, the literal terminology here is it was placed upon his heart concept. It was placed upon him. It weighed on him. It's a defilement that's not just the food itself. Like they may have been eating pork for all I know, but there's also, whenever you eat at the king's table and eat this kinds of food, generally speaking, you're eating food that's been sacrificed to a god of some sort, with the meats and so forth. Remember, they did the same thing in Israel. They would sacrifice the meat, right? And then the priests and so forth, they would get food from those sacrifices that took place. And so many scholars believe, based upon their study of history in Babylon and its empire, that part of this was Daniel understood that some of this meat may or may have, if you will, been sacrificed to us. But did you catch something? Now, granted, there are people from all nations mixed into this, but Daniel and his three friends are certainly not the only Jewish people that showed up here. But one thing I caught, did you notice nobody else from Israel seemed to bat an eye at this? That struck me. So we're talking about the courage Daniel had, starting in verse 8. It takes courage to not just go with the crowd as well, doesn't it? It takes courage to be different. Could you imagine, you ever been in a situation in school or something where someone wants to point something out or ask the teacher a question and everyone's saying, no, don't do it, because then we're all going to suffer for whatever it is? I don't know what he faced pressure-wise. I mean, it's bad enough not knowing what the king's going to do at your request, but Daniel was the only one who stood up and talked about this. I think that's interesting. The food would have been unclean in how it was prepared. Food would have been unclean in what they were eating. It was probably unclean ceremonially in that it was probably, and most likely at times at least, offered to gods. And I only see one man stand up and say, hey, the four of us don't really want to eat this food because of what our God teaches. That takes courage, doesn't it? Courage to be different. Courage to not go with the flow. Courage to risk everything, literally, your life. But I also want to point out that courage was manifest in a way that was respectful to the office that God had given Nebuchadnezzar. Because remember, Romans says God sets up kings and kingdoms and tears them down, right? God was actually using Nebuchadnezzar to fulfill the punishment for Judah. So when Daniel brought this up, now I fully believe if he said there is no way we can change your dietary law, I fully believe Daniel still would have not partaken of the food. He would have figured something else out. But he had courage. He had discipline, didn't he? It takes discipline to see all this stuff in front of you and not take of it. It takes discipline to know that whatever may come, you have to do the right thing. Isn't that discipline? That's what we hopefully train our children up to do, is the right thing no matter what. You do the right thing no matter the cost. It takes discipline. And Daniel had courage and he had discipline. Those are so obedience, courage, and discipline are characteristics, traits, if you will, of his faith, do we have those traits in our faith? Do we have the obedience, but do we have the courage and the discipline to obey even when it goes against the grain? Even when it's hard, even when we're going to get made fun of, even when it might bring trouble upon us for doing the right thing. Daniel's faithfulness to God is non-negotiable, even when the king has given him and ordered him to do something. However, Daniel, he objects in a respectful manner. I've always loved that about Daniel, that he does it in a respectful manner. So then we get into, so far, if you're writing this down, Daniel's faith was one of obedience, courage, and discipline. Obedience, courage, discipline. But we now get to the next place. I'm going to go to verse 9 here, and then we'll read further. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, and look at this, this is interesting. I fear my lord the king, who assigned you food and your drink. For why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? This had nothing to do with him believing in the God. It had to do with the guy wanting to save his own skin, which is completely understandable, isn't it? He says, it basically, how do I know by changing your diet, you're not going to be a lot weaker and you're not going to have your appearance messed up and you're not going, how do I know you're going to be up to snuff, if you will, up to par with the king? And then look what he asks. So you would endanger my head with the king, or I guess he makes a statement there. In other words, you have to be comparable to all these other people sitting at this table, but you're trying to endanger my life by making a change. What I love is Daniel's response, because Daniel's response is a response of confidence. And this is the fourth point here, confidence. His faith was a confident faith. Because he knew God would work it out if he just followed God. Did he know God was going to make this dietary law stick? I don't think so. What I think he knew is regardless of whether it stuck or not, God was going to work it out and save both of them if the guy just gave him a chance. And so this is what Daniel said to the steward in verse 11. Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In verse 12, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Yummy. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. In other words, put us side to side, compare us to each other, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Did you catch that? Feed us vegetables and water. In 10 days, compare us with the others, and then based upon what you see, do what you like with us. He had confidence in God, didn't he? He was confident that God would take care of him, that God would make sure that God's interests were upheld. And I believe he knew God rewarded faithfulness. Look in verse 14. So the man listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days in verse 15. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. So he had confidence in God. He was disciplined and had the courage to stay true to what God had asked and to request that so that he could obey God. You ever thought about what everybody else at that table thought of Daniel after they got all that really good food and wine taken away from them? They had been eating like kings this whole time. And then in a matter of 10 days, they go from eating like kings and eating like royalty, which they're used to because they're noble children. They go to vegetables and water. But Daniel was confident that God would take care of him, and God followed through. God followed through on it. Because of Daniel's obedience, courage, discipline, and confidence, God gave Daniel a few things. He gave him knowledge and intelligence, and he also gave him the ability to interpret visions and dreams. He gave him knowledge and intelligence and the ability to interpret visions and dreams. And we see that his three friends also were rewarded for their faithfulness, and we'll see that as we go through the book as well. But look in verse 17 through the end of the chapter. As for the four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Do you see that? God allowed them to, basically what this is getting at is they quickly picked it up. They excelled in these things. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not sure that they received that because only Daniel is said to receive that here. At the end of the time when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, now the end of the time, this would most likely be 3 years later from the start, generally speaking, going back to the way the Persians did it and the way we have some records of the Babylonians as well as Josephus and a few others who refer back to this, although they lived a long time after the Babylonians. Generally, they would be educated for 2 to 3 years before they enter into the service of the king. And so at the end of that time, which is 2 to 3 years here, the king had commanded that they should be brought in, and the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found. Listen to this. None was found to be like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Did you catch that? Because of their obedience, courage, discipline, and confidence, God rewarded them. He gave them such great knowledge and intelligence and gave Daniel the ability to interpret the visions and dreams so greatly that they were far better than anybody. Even in their youth, they were better than anybody in the kingdom. And when it says they stood before the king, that's an ancient way of saying they served the king directly. They didn't serve a servant of a servant of a servant of a king. They served the king directly. They were the go-to men for the king on these matters. Why? Because they had faith that was obedient. They were courageous and disciplined, and they had confidence in God. That God was in control, that God ordains, and God sets up and tears down kings and kingdoms. They understood that at the end of the day, no matter where they found themselves, no matter what was going on, no matter what pandemic is going on in the world, no matter who wins the Super Bowl, no matter who's in the White House, they understood one thing, and that is God is always in control. And that's why their faith led them to obedience, courage, discipline, and confidence. And God rewarded that. Guys, the cool thing is God still rewards those things. It may not be the same. We may not be advisors to the president himself, right? But God still rewards us when we have faith like Daniel and his three friends. This chapter is important historically, but it's important spiritually for us as well. It's important spiritually because we live in an uncertain time where things are just seeming to get more and more chaotic as we go, and we need to remember and we need to let the world know things are not out of hand. God is in control. Now, we may not understand or we may not agree with God on what that should look like, but God is still there. God is still working. And God's will is ultimately going to be done. And we get to take that message to all of those who are searching for something greater. Isn't that awesome? Church, I want to encourage you to remember that God's in control, to proclaim that God's in control, to have faith like Daniel and his friends, faith that's obedient, that's courageous, that's disciplined, and that's confident, so that God can bless you as well as those who you meet. Let's go to God in prayer, and then next week we'll be in chapter 2 of Daniel. Father,